And now we move into our third and final keynote address with Rabbi Elise Goldstein. This time, the rabbi will be joined by all three of our esteemed responders, Linnea Good, Ken Quiring, and Jan Beal. As part of that, they will together moderate a bit of a question and answer time at the end of the rabbi's presentation. The chat will be turned off during the address itself, but turned back on following it so that you can write your questions then. Most of us met Rabbi Elise Goldstein on Friday when she led us in reflecting on Holy Word and some of the challenges in translating it, and then on the book of Deuteronomy. This morning, Midrash. Welcome back, Rabbi Goldstein.
Thank you so much. And it's been an incredible privilege to be with you. And I'm very much looking forward to this morning and a chance for us to dialogue. I think I got some questions through Huva. So if somebody can find those out and bring them, because I'm not registered on that app, that would be great. But I'm looking forward to this morning. And I think we have a telling this morning to start us off.
We do. We have two. And so let me introduce you to our tellers for this portion, the Reverend Faye London, a pastor in the United Methodist tradition from Crownsville, Maryland, and Reverend Bev Brazier, a United Church minister currently serving in Pools Cove, Newfoundland and Labrador. Let's hear the stories that they will tell us and the next generation.
Exodus chapter 3. Moses, tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And a messenger from the Eternal appeared to him there in a blazing fire out of a bush. And he gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, and yet the bush was not consumed. Moses said, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? And when the Eternal saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him out of the bush, saying, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. God said, don't come closer, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground. And I'm the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses covered his face. He was afraid to look at God. The Eternal said, I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt, and I have heeded their outcry because of their taskmasters, and I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land and into a land, a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. And moreover, I've seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to the Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. And Moses said, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and rescue the Israelites from Egypt? And God said, I'll be with you, and that shall be your sign that it was I who sent you. And when you have rescued the people from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain.
But Moses said to Adonai, "Oh, please, oh my Lord, I've never been a man of words, even in times past, and now that you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." And Adonai said to him, "Who gives humans speech? Who makes them dumb or deaf or sighted or blind? Is it not I, Adonai? Now go, and I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you what to say." But Moses said, "Please, oh my Lord, since make someone else your agent." Then Adonai became angry with Moses and said, "Well, there is your brother Aaron, the Levite. He, I know, speaks readily. Even now, he is setting out to meet you and will be happy to see you. And you shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. And I will be with you and with him as you speak and tell you both what to do. And he shall speak for you to the people. Thus he shall serve as your spokesman, with you playing the role of God to him."
Thank you both so much. That was absolutely beautiful. Everything I hoped for, because it gives me an opportunity to reflect on how your telling, and the two tellings yesterday that I was privileged to hear, are midrash. How storytelling from the Bible is actually midrash. So I'm going to give you an example, but before I do that, let me quickly define what midrash is and why we use it when we are teaching from the Torah or the Tanakh, and its uses and its misuses, and how you as biblical storytellers can embrace it and use it in your own storytelling. So let's just look at the word midrash for a moment. It's a Hebrew word, and it comes from the Hebrew root dalid resh shin, darash, which means to seek or search. Its root is from the book of Genesis 25, chapter 22. And again, let me remind people, as I reminded you yesterday, don't worry about taking notes. Do not worry about taking notes. I'm going to send you all of my notes, and you will have all these verses in front of you, because I really worry about people missing something because they were writing down Genesis 25, 22. I promise you're going to get it. But this idea of midrash comes from this amazing story in Genesis 25, 22 of Rebecca, when Rebecca discovers that she's pregnant with twins, and it's problematic for her. She goes to seek God, lidrosh et Adonai. And from there, the rabbis, the ancient rabbis, and when I say the rabbis, I don't mean the rabbis like me. I mean the rabbis of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century up to the 5th century, the rabbis who were the authors of the Talmud, the book of Jewish law, which encompasses how we look at being Jews today. We're no longer biblical Jews. We don't sacrifice animals. We don't make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. We're rabbinic Jews. So when I say the rabbis, I mean those decisors of Jewish law. By the way, those rabbis, including me, are the progeny of the Pharisees. So it's a good question for another session on how to understand who the Pharisees were and who they became. At any rate, the rabbi said, to go and seek God, what it means is to understand what God is trying to say, because the Torah is not always clear. Now, I know that's a problematic statement for people who believe in the literal word of God. And yet we understand that the Bible, the Torah itself, has no punctuation, as I told you yesterday, no periods, no commas, no exclamation marks, no question marks. And therefore, everything we read into it is an interpretation of sorts. Lidrosh, midrash, also comes from Ecclesiastes, where it says, Ecclesiastes 1:13, I set my mind to study and to probe with wisdom all that happens under the sun. Amos 5:4 says, Dirshuni v'chayu, sorry, in the plural, Dirshuni v'chayu, seek me and live. So what does it mean to seek God? Through the words of Torah. It means to understand and to apply the words of Torah through the exegesis or through the systematic use of midrash. Now I'm going to give you an example that you probably didn't know you were doing. So when Bev was telling the story, and God speaks to Moses from the burning bush and says twice, Moses, Moses. Moses answers, Hineni. Now, Bev, when she told the story, made that into a question, said, here I am, here I am. And that was beautiful. That was a midrash, because the text itself only says that one word, here I am. And it's the same word that Abraham uses in the book of Genesis when God calls to him and says, take your son, your only son, the son that you love, and bring him up to a mountain that I will show you. Abraham answers, Hineni. So the midrash, that is the rabbinic parable and the rabbinic interpretations that abound on that, see those two parallels. Moses said it, Abraham said it earlier, and look at both stories and say, what's common in the two stories? What's common in the two stories is a moment, an act of faith. And so the rabbis have understood that word hineni to have an exclamation mark, not a question mark. So I loved, Bev, when you were telling the story and you made it into a question mark, because that's midrash. What did Moses mean when he said to the burning bush, which is the first revelation there that Moses had of Adonai, here I am? Did Moses mean it with a question mark? Did Moses mean it with an exclamation mark? We don't know, because the Torah doesn't have punctuation. And so however we midrash that, however we understand it, changes the story completely, if it was a question mark or an exclamation mark. Neither one is right nor wrong. And so I told a story yesterday that I'm going to retell this morning to prove to you that neither one is right nor wrong. When I was a young rabbi in Toronto a million years ago, the Sisters of Zion, a Catholic order, invited me to come teach Torah weekly to them. And at the end of, I think, 8 or 10 weeks of teaching them this idea of midrash and commentary, they were incredibly frustrated. They said to me, Rabbi, we loved every class, but we hate that there's no right answer. Which is it, a question mark or an exclamation mark? What did God mean? In a Jewish framework, there's no way to know that. The only way to know that is to look at midrash, parables, questions, interpretations that have been already written down through the century, from the pre-1st century BCE until the 5th, well, actually until about the 13th century CE, and including today. And I'll tell you the difference between classical midrash and modern midrash. The only way to know that is to read those commentaries. And at the end of the day, what is really frustrating for some and exhilarating for others, at the end of the day, is no one agrees. One rabbi says it's an exclamation point. One rabbi says it's a question mark. Neither rabbi says the other one is wrong. And there's nowhere in Jewish writings that says, no, 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 it's definitely a question mark. No, 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 it's definitely an exclamation point. It is as we read it. It is as we hear it. It is as we understand it. It is as we interpret it. And so we use midrash. let me explain to you how we use Midrash and why we use Midrash and how you can use Midrash and how Jesus used Midrash. Because Jesus, coming from that milieu, that rabbinic, Pharisaic milieu, was familiar with this way of thinking about text. So there's 4 levels of looking at a biblical text in the Jewish way of thinking. And the acronym for those 4 ways is Pardes, P-R-D-S, Pardes. Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. Pshat, the top level, if you will, is the simple way of looking at the text. What does the text mean? The verse in terms of what we've derived from the words using the disciplines of language, syntax, grammar. The goal of Pshat, the most simple reading, the absolute, Pshat means simple, the absolute surface meaning of the verse emerges through that analysis of syntax and grammar and looking at other stories and how it's used in other places. And so in Pshat, in the simplest meaning of that, there's a bush, it's burning, God is in that bush, or a messenger of God is in that bush, a divine messenger, human messenger. And then the simple meaning is Moses sees the bush and says, okay, here I am. The next level is Remez. And Remez is, what is the verse hinting at? Is the verse hinting at that every time we have an encounter with God, we better stay a little bit back because it's hot, maybe too hot to handle, it's a burning bush? Is the hint of the verse that we need to answer Hineni, here I am, when we're called? So there's Pshat, there's Remez, and there's Drash. Drash is the parable, the homiletic layer of the verse. What's it trying to teach us? How can we explain it? How can we expand upon it? We use a broader spectrum of meaning, allusions to other ideas, further information relating to the context, the situation known to the rabbis through tradition. That's the level we're going to talk about now. And there's Sod. Sod is the secret. Sod is the mystical level. Sod is the deepest bottom level. Now, when you're a Jew and you study Torah, you try and get to all 4 levels. Can you imagine? Can you imagine on one verse, on one word, let's just use that word, Hineni, here I am. If I went through those 4 levels, take me an hour on one word. That's why Jews study forever and for always and never get to the bottom of it. So why do we use Midrash and why do we need Midrash? Barry Holtz, who's one of the great Jewish biblical scholars, says this: Midrash comes into play as a way of resolving crisis and reaffirming continuity with the traditions of the past. Because we have a crisis when we come to a verse and we don't know what it means. We come to a crisis when we come to a verse and we don't know, was Moses speaking with a question mark or an exclamation mark? It changes the story, which one we choose. And so to solve that crisis, the rabbis write parables. The rabbis write interpretations. The rabbis write commentary. And you read all of those commentaries and all of those interpretations, and it helps you understand how you want to understand that exclamation of Hineni, here I am. The second way that we use Midrash is it proves that the Torah is a constantly open and living document. There is no wrong Midrash. It helps us see the Torah as speaking to us in every age. If we just use the Pshat, if we just use the simple, basic, bottom line meaning of the verse, we wouldn't be able to relate to it through the Crusades. We wouldn't be able to relate to it in the Holocaust. We wouldn't hear ourselves or see ourselves in it in 2024. We would say that was then, this is now. It's too easy, it's too facile to look at some of the difficult parts of the Torah, let's say the laws of homosexuality, and say, well, that was then. They didn't understand, and this is now. The laws of rape, the laws of punishing a wayward and rebellious child. Oh, that was then. They were primitive. They didn't understand. This is now. That makes the Torah a closed book. It was a then book. It's not a now book. And so we must use Midrash to understand what it means now, what it meant to them, and what it means to us. My favorite example of this, and it's used by Jews and Christians alike, is the laws of kashrut, the laws of keeping kosher, why we don't eat pig. So lots of people like to say, oh, that's a health thing. You see, they knew about trichinosis back then. They knew that the pig was not a healthy animal to eat. No, 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 no. Because if the Torah was a book of health, if the Torah was a book about not eating well, it would make us all vegetarians. It would tell us not to eat chicken fat, that's for sure. And a lot of Jewish delicacies would be down the drain. The Torah is not a book of science, nor is it a book of health. And it's too easy to say that was then, this is now. That was then, they didn't know about trichinosis, but this is now, we do so we can eat pork. It's not about that. That's why we need Midrash to understand what it's about for us today. The third reason we use Midrash is that it can be argued that the Bible itself contains Midrash. So, for example, the latter books of Chronicles explain and interpret parts of the narrative presented in the earlier books of Kings. And as I told you in another session, there's several versions of the book of Noah, of the story, the narrative of Noah and the flood. And I don't know if you know this and go back to Genesis and read it, but there's one account in Genesis of the flood being 40 days and 40 nights. And we've decided that that's the real account. There's another account of being 120 days and nights. But we've all glommed onto the 40 days and 40 nights and the animals 2 by 2. What happened to the fish? They weren't taken 2 by 2. How come they survived, right? And so the Midrash comes to answer that question that the Torah itself doesn't answer. And one could say the second narrative of the creation of female is a Midrash on the first narrative of the creation of human. Because remember, we heard this telling yesterday, in Genesis chapter 1, it says, male and female were they created. The Adam, the earthling, the human being, it says very clearly in chapter 1, is Zachar u'Nekeva, male and female. But then all of a sudden in chapter 2, we get a female. Well, what happened to the female in chapter 1? Midrash comes to tell a story. It tells a parable. And the parable is unbelievable. So I'm going to tell it to you. It's a Midrash. So the female in chapter 1 had a name. Her name was Lilith. And she demanded equality with Adam because she said, we're both created of the humus, of humanity, of the soil. We're both human. We're both created. We are both equal. Well, Adam didn't like that and went to complain to God. Now, of course, please remember, this text is not in the Torah. This is a parable that was written by the rabbi centuries later. Adam goes to complain to God, says, wait, that woman you created for me in chapter 1, she wants to be equal. What kind of nonsense is that? Now create for me one that's bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, one that's taken from me so that I can tell her what to do. And so Adam and God collaborate on this, and Eve, mother of all life, is created. That's not in the text. That may not be what Genesis 1 and 2 really mean, but it's a fanciful parable to help us answer the question, what happened to the female in chapter 1? The fourth reason we use Midrash is it's classic Jewish storytelling. It allows the Torah to be told as a story and not only as a legal narrative. And I told you in another setting, we never translate the Torah as the law. It's a Christian translation, and it's a translation with an agenda. It's a translation to say, well, the Old Testament is a book of law and the New Testament is a book of love. We don't translate the Torah as the book of law. We see the Torah as one great narrative. And so Midrash gives us a chance to play with that narrative in a way that is allowed. in a way that is fanciful, in a way that is heartfelt, in a way that is emotive and emotional. The Song of Songs Midrash, the Midrash on Song of Songs, the rabbinic Midrash on Song of Songs says, do not treat the parables as a trivial thing, for it's through the parables that one can come to understand the deepest secrets of Torah. So the fifth reason we use the Midrash is to understand whether it's a question mark or an exclamation mark. And maybe there's a secret in there. Maybe there's a teaching in there. Maybe there's something we need to hear in there. Now, I need you to understand that Midrash never supplants Torah. It supports Torah. Never supplants Torah. It supports Torah. So we can't, the only bottom line is we can't make a Midrash that would contradict the Torah. We can't make a Midrash that eating pork is okay. We can't make a Midrash that the Sabbath is not on the seventh day. We can't make a Midrash that would say that, the waters didn't part at the Red Sea. Midrash supports Torah and doesn't supplant Torah. So what does it do? It solves seeming contradictions. So for example, in Exodus 17:12, no, I'm going to skip that example. I'm going to give a better example because we're coming towards Passover. So, the frogs that are the plague that come from Pharaoh. So actually the word in Hebrew is frog. It doesn't say, it says different times it says frogs, but the actual plague itself says, and there was a frog. Oh, the rabbis go crazy with that. What do you mean one giant frog swallowed all of Egypt? So we have to solve the contradictions between there being many frogs and one great frog. And there's all these, you find these, I'll tell you where you find these midrashim later, but there's all these midrashim, plural of midrash, that say that the one big frog swallowed all the other frogs, or that the one big frog put Pharaoh's head in its mouth and Pharaoh said, oh my God, let my people go, So it's fanciful, but it does help us solve some contradictions. It explains difficult or unclear words. Remember, in my session about translation, I said, how do we know what a word means? We sometimes look at it in other contexts, but what if it's a hapaxlegomenon? It's a one-time word. It only appears once in the whole Bible. Midrash comes to help us fill in what that word means. It answers the missing who, what, where, why, when. It fills in absent conversations or characters. The most famous midrash at all for that is the Genesis 21, the story of the Akedah, or the near sacrifice of Isaac. So we have in that narrative, God calls Abraham, says, take your son, your only son, the son whom you love. And we have Abraham talking back to God in the midrash, not in the Torah. In the midrash, Abraham says to God, but I have two sons. Ishmael is one. Which one? Which one? I love them both. Take the son, your only son, the son whom you love. Which one of those two should I be taking? And then there's a whole conversation about that. And Abraham and Isaac go up the mountain for 3 days in silence. The Midrash supplies all that conversation. What did they talk about? You mean for 3 days, a father and son go up a mountain without talking? No, the Midrash gives us that conversation, fills in the who, the what, the why. Third question that arises from the story in Genesis 21 is, where's Sarah? Sarah's like asleep in the tent, wakes up, the son she bore in her 90s is gone to some unforeseen place, to a God that they can't see, can't speak to. What happens to Sarah? Well, in the very next chapter, Sarah dies. So the Midrash fills in that blank and says Sarah died of a broken heart. The Midrash humanizes the story, brings in the emotions. That is what we use Midrash for. Now, the Sisters of Zion couldn't understand how we allow that, because it means that we get to tell the story in our own words. So everything you've done, all the storytelling you tell, is given to you, I would say, as a gift of the earlier rabbis who permitted the use of Midrash to understand the Torah. Now, there's two kinds of Midrash. one is classical midrash and one is modern midrash. Just going to give you the facts so you'll know what you're doing. Classical midrash is a systematic way to interpret a biblical text. It's composed between about 400 of the Common Era to about 1200 of the Common Era. It's compiled in books called the Midrash, Midrash. You can go online and Google Midrash and you'll get some of the books. The great books are called Midrash Rabbah. There's one Midrash Rabbah for each of the books of the Torah. There's Genesis Rabbah, Exodus Rabbah, Leviticus Rabbah, Numbers Rabbah, and Deuteronomy Rabbah. And each one of them has stories about stories in the Torah. And you can get those in English. And you can use them in your storytelling. You can also use a great book called Legends of the Torah by Ginsburg. And in Legends of the Torah by Ginsburg, he has compiled in English the best of those stories about stories from the 5 Rabbah books, the 5 books of Midrash on the Torah. Louis Ginsburg. I think it's called Legends of the Jews. In Hebrew, it's Sefer Haggadah, and I'll look it up for you during the questions to make sure that I give you the right title in English. That's classical Midrash. I cannot write a Midrash today in 2024 and call it Genesis Rabbah. I'm just not allowed. Anything I write from about 1200 on, the last compilation of Midrash, is called modern Midrash. So modern Midrash flows from classical Midrash, but it doesn't necessarily stick with it. So as Christian storytellers and as Christians, I want you to be very careful with how you use the term Midrash, because it's an appropriative term. It's a term from our tradition, how we use it, and I know that it's used in different terms, in different ways in Christian parlance. So I want you to be careful and to know what it means from its Jewish source, from its Jewish root. Classical Midrash, written by the rabbis, and sort of closed and not canonized, but sort of closed around 1200, 1300, and modern Midrash, the Midrash that we use today. So today, there's feminist Midrash, there's queer Midrash, there's Israeli Midrash, there's North American Midrash, all of that would be called modern Midrash. I don't know how many of you have read the book, The Red Tent by Anita Diamond. That's a modern Midrash, the whole book, in which she retells the story of Dinah from Dinah's own perspective. That would be called modern. A lot of us think of that book as modern Midrash in book form. So biblical fiction could be seen as modern Midrash. Now, I want to conclude with the big chunk for you. Did Jesus use this method of storytelling? So I told you that it starts about 400, so that would be problematic in terms of dating. But there's earlier forms of classic Midrash, which were not written down, which were oral, and those were pre-first century, early rabbinic Midrash that Jesus would have known. How would Jesus have known this? Because Jesus was in that milieu and studied that kind of Torah study, or used that kind of Torah study. The earliest rabbis that used that methodology were called Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Hillel. And did Jesus know them? Did Jesus study with them? Depends on how you date Jesus's life, but they are from pre-first century. And so their method of homiletics, of interpretation, would have been known to Jesus. The Pauline use of the phrase, as it is written, is Midrash, because in the classical Midrash, just about every classical Midrash has within it that phrase, kakatuv, as it is written. And so classical midrash has to have a proof text. You can't just make up a story without a proof text. So the proof text would be as it is written. And that Pauline use of as it is written is classical midrash, because Paul's using Torah text as proof text for what he is trying to teach. So the most interesting, I think, and challenging midrash of all would be the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. So the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, interprets the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 as Jesus, while the Jewish interpretation of that sees the suffering servant as the people of Israel. So there are two midrashim, perhaps one could say at odds with each other, perhaps one could say just two ways of looking, but that's a beautiful example of where the Christian tradition, because we don't know who the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 is. Isaiah 53 doesn't say, and the suffering servant is, okay? So where the Jewish midrash sees suffering servant as Israel, the Christian midrash, she sees suffering servant as Jesus. That's a beautiful example of a use of parable and homily and interpretation and seeking out the meaning and different levels to figure out what a word means. Where else do you see midrash in the Christian scriptures? Matthew 5, the Beatitudes. The meek shall inherit the land comes from Psalms 37:11. So there is Matthew, a midrash on Psalm 37. One could say yes. Jesus explains the meek in Psalm 37 are the poor in spirit. And the phrase inherit the land needs to be understood in a midrashic sense. The land is the kingdom of heaven. So the Christian scripture is making a midrash on the book of Psalms. And the Jewish midrash on that verse, inherit the land, is interpreted as all Israel has a share in the world to come. As it is said, your people, all of them, will be righteous. They will inherit the land forever. That phrase is from the Midrash on Psalms. I could give you lots more examples in the Christian scriptures, but you know them. You know the references to the Torah in the Christian scriptures and the references to Tanakh, the writings and the songs which come from the Christian scriptures. I want you to understand them as interpretations on the Hebrew scriptures, which Jesus would have been very familiar with this methodology. As I said, the classical midrash is written down around 400, but in Jesus's time, in the pre-first century and the first century, this methodology is very commonly used. It's a Pharisaic methodology. It's a Pharisaic interpretation. We're not Pharisees today. Today, the rabbis take that place, but the Pharisees use this methodology of understanding a verse in their teachings and in their gatherings. And so this is something that the early Christians would have been very, very familiar with. And the need to interpret scripture and the crisis, as Barry Holt says, of not understanding a verse and then not knowing how to live it is solved then through this methodology. So this is where I want to conclude this morning, because I wanted very much to leave a lot of time for us to have some conversation, not only about this morning's presentation, but about the other two presentations as well. So I am going to end with a blessing. We yesterday did the blessing for Torah study in the first session, and we ended the second session with Psalms, how good it is and how pleasant it is to sit together in unity. And today I'm going to use a very interesting classic Jewish midrash. that after you're done studying, you praise God as eternal and steady, and you use the words of Kaddish. Now, some of you who have been to Jewish funerals know that that is a mourner's prayer, and yet we use it. I'm just bringing it up on my screen. Yet we use it after we've studied a piece of Torah to extol the virtue of, or the eternity of God. That same prayer is used when we lose somebody we love, the Kaddish. And we became a mourner's prayer because after the study of Torah in the yeshivas, in Jewish study halls, people would say, but I learned something great from my teacher. And I want to quote my teacher, but my teacher's no longer in the world of the living. And so I want to say this blessing, this prayer for my teacher who is no longer with us, who taught me something beautiful. And after a while, it rolled into this tradition where people would say, but my father was my teacher, but my mother was my teacher, but my sibling was my teacher. And so we say this blessing for our family, for our blood relatives whom we've lost, because we said it for our teachers and we understood that our family are our first teachers and that we memorialize their teaching by saying this prayer. So I am going to end this session by saying this beautiful prayer of praise. Yitkadal v'yitkadash mirabah, ba'alma divrach yurtei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayachon v'yomechon v'chayed chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kariv v'yimru. Amen. We sanctify the great name of God throughout the world, which was created according to divine will. May the rule of peace be established speedily in our time, unto us, the entire household of Israel, and all humanity. And let us say, Amen. I don't know if we're going to have, do we have a respondent who's going to moderate? I think all of the respondents are coming on. Great.
We do.
Great. And I've left a good amount of time because I hope there are questions that you've received in the small groups on any of the presentations. And let me say again, what a joy this has been for me to teach.
Wow, what a joy it's been for us. So rich, so much. Though we three responders are here, and though we look like we're here to respond and talk, actually we have now become moderators. So we want to invite people. We've never had the chat open while we've been respectfully listening to our keynote address, but now it's open. And I am guessing that some folks have just been chomping at the bit to have questions that they wish that they could ask. So chat is the place to do it. We'll call it Q&A, but we're going to look forward to you putting your questions here in the chat for us to kind of take turns looking at and be reading and see what it is that we want to direct toward the rabbi.
And if the three of you have any questions that have come up in the small groups, I'm happy to start with those.
So feel free to do that. Often we are silenced like the child just about to come out and greet the world. We're silenced by all that, the enormity of it all. But take a little moment and write a question. And two people are going to be reading, and one person's going to ask a question. So, Rabbi, I'm going to ask you a question just while folks are just kind of collecting their thoughts. A question that came up yesterday as we were talking in some of our churches for a while, we recognized that saying the Old Testament when we were talking about that part of our Bible, that did not feel like the right name for it.
Mm-hmm.
And we began to call it the Hebrew Scriptures. And then then I think it was pointed out that those were not the Hebrew scriptures, and sort of not get ourselves mixed up about this is the Jewish Bible. So then that was kind of, we wondered about that. And so the question was, would it be okay for us to call at least the first 5 books in our Bible, to call them the Torah, or is that steering in a wrong direction?
I'm so appreciative of the question, because I said, you have to be careful of appropriative terms like midrash. So if you use the term in its purity, so if you were talking about the classical midrash, you should use the term midrash. If you're talking about a Christian interpretation of something in the Christian Bible, I would feel uncomfortable with you using the term midrash for that. So that's a good example of appropriative terms that are not living in the right space. Torah is not an appropriative term because that's the word for that 5 books of Moses. So I would be joyful if you would use the word Torah or Torah in its Hebrew pronunciation.
Is it the same? Like the first 5 books of our Bible, are they the same as
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, in that order? That's the Torah.
Yes.
Yeah. So when I would have no trouble with you when you're telling a story to say this is from Exodus in the Torah. I think people will be maybe a little bit uncomfortable or shocked by that, but if you were reading that scripture in church as part of a Christian service, I would be uncomfortable if you said, we're now going to read from the Torah. Because you're not reading from the scroll that I read from. You're not reading it in Hebrew. You're reading from the Jewish Bible, for example. You could also say, our scripture reading this morning is from the Hebrew scriptures, known in the Jewish world as the Torah, or known by Jews as the Torah, or called by Jews as the Torah, because that's so respectful. So when I'm teaching, so I use the word New Testament, even though Jews don't use that word, right? Because I'm doing it out of respect for you. It is the book that you call the New Testament. I could have said what Christians call the New Testament, right? Because for us to call it the New Testament means there's an Old Testament, an old truth. And so we don't use that term. We use Christian scriptures or Christian Bible, but I don't like that Christian Bible, Jewish Bible thing. It feels very divisive. So I much prefer.
Christians would say too, it's not appropriate. There have been lots of historical arguments about, well, is that actually our Bible? Maybe we should get rid of it and just focus on the Gospels, or on the new revelation. No, the entire Bible is our Bible.
But again, if we think broadly, we could see the entire Christian scriptures, or let's call it from the Gospels, right, as midrash on the Hebrew scriptures, because the people who wrote it were Jewish, right? So they were living still in a Jewish milieu, and this is how one taught scriptures. One taught scriptures by interpreting them, by quoting them, by saying, here's what they mean, by saying, here's how to live them, right? Now, Jesus, when I don't know who it is that says it, and you'll have to give me the scriptural quote, but when you're talking about the laws of kashrut, right? It's not what goes in a man's mouth, but what comes out. Like, that's a midrash on our laws of kashrut, but it's a problematic midrash for us, right? Because it dismisses what the Torah says, right? It objects to what the Torah says and says, we don't have to follow that. Yeah. That's why it's a Christian midrash on what the Torah says, as opposed to, for us, as opposed to law. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, yes, and I'm going to pass it over to Ken with one of the questions that has been identified.
Okay, well, as storytellers, one of the questions we would have is focused on what we were dealing with on Friday, a passage from Deuteronomy. Just wondering if you have a specific interpretation you can give to the phrase, these words that I charge you today are in your heart, or keep these words in your heart. Talk about do a little midrash for us and help us appropriate those in a beautiful, living kind of way?
So it says in Hebrew, al levavecha, upon your heart. So there's lots of different interpretations of that, right? One is, for Jews at least, wear your Judaism on your sleeve, right? Don't be embarrassed. Don't tuck your Jewish star away, like many of us are doing now. Don't, so that, keep it on your heart, al levavecha, on your heart. You could also read al levavecha as in your heart, right? But here's the most interesting piece of all. The heart in Torah, in the Hebrew, is not the seat of emotions. The seat of emotions is the gut, right? Is the kidneys, actually. And the heart is the seat of intellect, because the Bible doesn't, the Torah has no brain. It doesn't talk about brains. Use your brains. It says use your heart to discern, right? And so the heart, lev in Hebrew, is the seat of discernment. It's not the seat of emotion. Why, why do we get all wrought up in the Torah? When people are angry, they get wrought up. It says that their klayot, which is the kidneys, are turning. That's being emotional. Yeah. So put these words in your heart also means understand them, study them, put them in your brain.
Jan, what do you see?
Well, I'm wondering if how you use midrash to wrestle with some of the difficult texts of divinely ordered violence. Those, I'm sure you get that question a lot. So how do you deal with that?
First of all, we don't only use midrash. That's an excellent question, but we do use midrash. But we use also what's called rabbinic interpretation. Yesterday, I quoted Rashi, one of the great medieval 12th century French commentators. We have a very long list of commentators, beginning with commentary from the Talmud in the 2nd century, the Book of Jewish Law, all the way through modern commentary. People like Rabbi Gunther Plaut of Toronto of blessed memory, who wrote a Torah commentary in the 1990s, right? I gathered female rabbis to write a commentary called the Women's Torah Commentary. You are welcome. Everybody is welcome to buy my book. It's called the Women's Torah Commentary. And it is 54. Remember, I told you there are 54 portions, 54 female rabbis, one on each portion from a feminist perspective. So it's called the Women's Torah Commentary. I edited that book. So that we would take difficult portions. For example, in my book, we take difficult portions for women and interpret them from a feminist perspective. So every word of the Torah has an interpretation or a commentary written about it. So we would look at those commentaries, we would look at the midrash, yes, and it helps us understand. And as I said before, the easiest answer is to say, well, that was then, this is now, but we don't. We want to understand, what was it? I don't have time, but I could give you some really classic, we could, maybe you'll invite me back, but we'll look at difficult verses and the Jewish interpreters on those verses, because there's some incredibly fantastic ones.
Michael is asking about, and it was a question of mine too, when you said it's not okay for us to just say, well, that was then and this is now. Now we understand more about food laws. The book is not a book of food laws. It's not a book of science. And Michael and I both, I think, wonder if we missed hearing you say what it is. Or maybe we're like the Sisters of Zion, would just tell us what it is then.
All right, this is also a question of faith. So you could ask 5 rabbis and you get 5 different answers, okay? What do we believe about the Torah? Anything from every word was dictated to Moses on Mount Sinai. Moses wrote it down without a single mistake, without a single interpretation, without a single human bias. handed it to the people of Israel, and that is what we have today. All the way through, it was written by four sets of authors, JEPD. I'm sure some of you have learned that. The Jehovahist and the Elohist, and the Deuteronomist, and the priestly writings, and it has no divinity in it, okay? So mostly liberal Jews like myself, I'm from the Reform movement, we are in the middle with what we term divine inspiration. So it's a book that has both human and divine voices in it, human and divine experience in it. What I like to say is it's the diary of my ancestors' experience that I am privileged to have. When I get a diary that I find in the attic of one of my grandparents, I'm not allowed to erase any of the difficult passages. If I find out something about my grandfather that I don't like, I can't erase that passage. Because I was given that diary to understand my grandfather, okay? So for me as a Jew, it is a diary of my people, diary of my ancestors, which they gave to me. They left for me after the desert and asked me to read it to understand the experience they had at the foot of Mount Sinai and all through the wandering and all the way back, if you will, to creation. And I can't erase anything. So I have to understand it, appreciate it, and make it live for me. So that's how I look at it.
So what do you do? What do you do with food laws?
Well, I keep them, so that's easy enough. So you are what you eat. The Torah is telling us to not eat bottom feeders, for example, so that we don't become bottom feeders. There's lots of interesting
them all?
Sorry?
Do you keep them all?
Well, there's not that many. First of all, I'm a vegetarian, so it makes not eating milk and meat very easy. I'm a vegetarian. But I keep all of them in the way, yes, in the broad sense of it. And many Jews, for example, who don't keep all the laws of kashrut, don't eat pork, because historically, that's what was forced upon us. When forced conversions and forced oppressions, and eat this pig, right? And so just for historical reasons, many Jews do not eat pork. But when asking someone if they keep all the laws of the Torah, remember that there are, well, according to Jewish counting, 613 laws. And some of them you can only do in the land of Israel, like the corners of your field, leaving the corners of your field for the poor. If I have a farm in Idaho, I can't leave the corners of my field, because that's a law that takes place only in the land of Israel. And some of the laws are only for priests, and I'm not a priest. I'm not a Kohen. So I can't keep that law, right? And some of the laws are only for children, and some of the laws are only for adults. No person, even the most Orthodox of Orthodox Jews, can keep all 613. And everybody would agree with me on that. Unless you're a high priest living in Jerusalem, then I guess, because you're male, you're a high priest, and you live in Jerusalem, you could probably keep all of them.
I'm going to ask we just have a few more minutes to just ask my colleagues here.
So there's questions about specific issues in the scriptures, food laws, or did kings exist, which are mentioned in Deuteronomy. What do we do with the teachings and the stories that are hard for us as a sensitive Western modern person to absorb? I'm thinking more of resources, because we can't answer every one of these. So one resource that I have loved from a Christian perspective is Ellen Davis, who wrote the book Opening Israel's Scriptures. And I think my sense is she does a very sensitive to Judaism approach. What would you have from a Jewish orientation and perspective that would be helpful for whether it's commentaries or one or two resources that you think would be really accessible for a Western Christian audience like most of us are?
That's a great question. And then I'll end with my, sort of final statement. But I'm going to give you authors rather than books, okay? So Barry Holtz, I mentioned, Holtz. But what I'll do also to make life easier for everybody is I'll put these on session 3. And Linnea, don't send out session 3 until I resend it to you, okay?
In fact, we're not sending them out, we're putting them as an attachment to each one of these keynote sessions. So whatever
Oh,
you
okay.
put there or James puts there, people will be able to find it. And if you want to add to it, then you get to take that out, just like we can't do with the Bible. Take it out, put something back in.
So you know what, Linnea, you can, session 3 is fine. I will give an additional document that you can
Okay.
put through Hoover. So Barry Holtz would be one, James Kugel would be another, and Jacob Neusner. So those are 3 great scholars. Also, I would just suggest that people buy a Jewish version of the Tanakh. So the Jewish Publication Society is a Jewish translation of the Tanakh. It has all the books in the order as we have them, the order of the Jewish order of the books. And I would also suggest that people buy a Jewish version of the Tanakh with commentary. There are 2 great ones out there. One is Rabbi Gunther Plaut of blessed memory, the Plaut commentary, Plaut. And so it's sort of kind of has a line-by-line commentary, which would be very, very helpful for you, I think. And the other is so that was put out by the Reform movement, and the other was put up by the Conservative movement, and it's phenomenal, and it's called Eitz Chaim. So I have to spell that for you. I think it's AITZ CHAYIM, and that is the commentary of the Conservative movement, and it was edited by Rabbi Harold Kushner, the great author of When Bad Things Happen to Good People. So of blessed memory as well. So those 2 commentaries are line-by-line commentaries in English, which will give you so much rich insight. So I'll make a document with that for you. So we have 3 minutes left, and I'm going to just have the last word, if that's okay. I want to talk about truth. So remember, this is as Zion said, what's the right answer? And people sometimes say to me, what's the truth? Like, did the Red Sea part? Do you really believe that the Red Sea parted, that there were frogs, all over Pharaoh's bed? Are these stories true? And I often get asked that question by my bar mitzvah students. Like, is it true, Rabbi, that the Red Sea parted and the Israelites walked on dry land? And so I always answer this as a rabbi in the following way. There's 2 kinds of truth, capital T and small t, right? Now you have to decide if scientific proof is a capital T truth or a small t truth, and if inner spiritual grounding truth is a capital T or a small t. So the Bible is true, but you have to decide if that's capital T or small t. Is it true scientifically? Did the Red Sea really part? Or is it true spiritual grounding for me to stand on, that my people were slaves and now they're free, and therefore everyone should be free, and therefore I have a relationship with the God who freed me, and therefore. So I can never answer the question, is the Bible true, without asking you, what do you mean by true? And that conversation is a typical Jewish conversation. It's a midrashic conversation. It's a conversation that is a conversation of discussion and debate. And that is the Jewish way of looking at the Torah always. We answer a question with a question. So my question for you is, what will you do with everything you've learned over these 3 sessions? How will it change you? How will it change the way you tell a biblical story? How will it enrich the way you tell a biblical story? And how will it challenge the way you tell a biblical story? And thank you so much for learning with me.